The fire crackled, a lone sound in the deep stillness of their chambers. For 15 years, this room had been a sanctuary, the heart of a kingdom and the core of their world. Here, Vlad was not the centuries-old king, the formidable power whose name was a bulwark against their enemies. And she was not his queen, a symbol of grace and lineage. Here they were simply Sophia and Vlad, two souls bound by a love that had weathered decades, politics, and the slow, grinding passage of immortal time. She watched him from her seat by the hearth, the firelight catching the silver threads in his dark hair, carving lines of profound kindness around his eyes. He was reading, his focus absolute, yet she knew a single word from her would bring his gaze, his entire being, to her instantly. That unwavering attention was one of the 1,000 things she loved about him. It was what had, over the course of 15 years, meticulously dismantled the walls around her heart. He had never pushed, never demanded the parts of her she kept locked away. He had simply been present, his love a patient, steady warmth, waiting for her to feel safe enough to step into the light. Tonight, she felt, was the night. The thought sent a tremor through her, a faint echo of an old, cold fear. She drew a breath, the air tasting of wood smoke and old stone. He felt the shift in her, his head lifting from the heavy tome in his lap. His eyes, the color of a twilight sky, found hers, and the world narrowed to the space between them. "Sophia?" His voice was low, a gentle rumble that had soothed her through countless nights. "There is something," she began, her own voice a fragile whisper. She cleared her throat, gathering the scattered fragments of her courage. "Something I have never told you, never told anyone." Instantly, the book was set aside. He moved from his chair to kneel before hers, taking her hands in his. His palms were warm and strong, a familiar, grounding pressure. He did not press, did not demand. He simply waited, his posture an embodiment of devotion. He was giving her the space to speak or to be silent, and he would honor either choice. It was this profound respect for her autonomy, that finally gave her the strength. "Before," she said, the words scraping her throat, "before I was turned, when I was still mortal." He nodded, his gaze unwavering. He knew this was a painful country for her to visit. Her human life had not been a happy one, a fact she had shared in brief, sorrowful sketches over the years. But she had never painted the full landscape of that sorrow. "I was young. A girl, really. At my family's country estate." The words came slowly, each one a stone she had to lift and carry into the light. "There was a nobleman, a guest of my father's. He was charming. Everyone thought so." She paused, her gaze drifting to the dancing flames, seeing not the fire but a face she had spent centuries trying to burn from her memory. "He cornered me in the library one evening. Everyone else was at dinner." The air in the room grew heavy, charged with the unspoken thing. Vlad's grip on her hands tightened, not with pressure, but with a supportive, anchoring weight. He said nothing, his silence a sacred vessel for her pain. "He did not care that I refused," she whispered, the shame of it, the remembered helplessness, still a bitter taste in her mouth even after all this time. He took what he wanted, and when he was done, he told me I should be grateful for the attention of a man of his station." A low growl vibrated in Vlad's chest, a primal, ancient sound of fury. But his eyes, when she dared to meet them, held only a universe of sorrow for her. He was not angry at her or for his own wounded pride. He was broken for the girl she had been, for the pain she had carried alone for so long. "My father did not believe me," she continued, the final, desolate piece of the memory. "Or perhaps he chose not to. The man was an important political ally. I was told to forget it, that I had imagined it or encouraged it, that I had brought shame on our house by speaking of it. The silence that followed was immense. It held the weight of a young girl's stolen innocence, a father's betrayal, and the long, lonely centuries of carrying that wound. Nightmares had plagued her for decades, even after the change, phantom memories of a library smelling of leather and fear. Vlad slowly lifted her hands and pressed his lips to her knuckles, a gesture of such reverence it brought tears to her eyes. "Sophia," he breathed against her skin. "Thank you." She looked at him, confused. "For what?" "For trusting me," he said, his voice thick with emotion. He finally looked up, and the depth of his love for her was a staggering thing to behold. "For allowing me to carry this with you. I am so sorry, my love. So sorry you endured that. So sorry you were alone in it." He cupped her face, his thumbs gently brushing away the tears she hadn't realized were falling. "This is your story, Sophia, your pain. It is sacred. I will hold it with the utmost care. Only you decide who knows, only you." The promise settled into the deepest part of her. It was an oath, a vow made in the sanctuary of their love. And as he held her, rocking her gently while she finally let the ancient grief wash through her, she felt a profound sense of peace settle over her. The final wall had crumbled. The last secret was shared. She was wholly known, wholly loved, and completely, utterly safe. The weight she had carried for more than 200 years finally lifted, entrusted to the one person in the world she knew would guard it with his life. The nightmares, she thought with a surge of impossible hope, might finally cease. She was safe. The story was safe with him. 3 months passed, a season of quiet healing and deepening intimacy. The nightmares did, in fact, recede, their sharp edges blunted by the balm of shared knowledge. Sophia felt lighter, as if a splinter, lodged deep in her soul for centuries, had finally been removed. The love between her and Vlad, already a formidable thing, deepened into something more profound, more complete. She moved through her days with a newfound ease, the shadows of the past no longer clinging so tightly to her heels. The trust between them was absolute, a flawless, perfect thing. It was a crisp autumn afternoon when she went looking for him. The council had been in session for hours, debating the new slate of laws proposed for the protection of women and children within the kingdom, a cause dear to her own heart. She had drafted several of the key provisions herself. Knowing Vlad would be weary from the endless arguments of the old guard lords, she had a tray prepared with a decanter of his preferred vintage and 2 glasses, intending to steal him away for a quiet moment. As she approached the great oak doors of the council chamber, she heard his voice, resonant and powerful, carrying through the heavy wood. A familiar warmth spread through her chest. He was a good king, a just king. He fought for what was right, even when it was unpopular. "And you say these protections are unnecessary," Vlad's voice rang out, sharp with impatience. "You claim the testimony we have heard is from women of low standing, that their experiences are not representative of the noble houses." Sophia paused just outside the door, which was slightly ajar. She smiled to herself, proud of his passion. He would win them over, he always did. "You speak of hypotheticals, of situations you cannot imagine," he continued, his tone shifting, becoming more personal, more weighty. "You believe this kind of cruelty does not touch our world, that it is a problem for mortals and the lesser born. You are wrong." A hush fell over the council. Sophia leaned closer, intrigued by his change in strategy. "I tell you now, this darkness can touch anyone. It is a poison that seeps into all levels of society. And we have a duty to protect all of our citizens, not just those whose voices are already powerful." He paused, and in that silence, Sophia felt a strange, prickling sense of unease. The air grew tense. "To make you understand that this is not some distant problem, I will share something with you. A truth that I hold in the deepest confidence." The unease coiled into a cold knot in her stomach. No, she thought, a frantic whisper in her mind. He wouldn't. My own wife, Vlad said, his voice ringing with righteous conviction, your queen, carries the scars of such a wound. Before she was granted the gift of immortality, she survived a terrible ordeal at the hands of a so-called nobleman. She knows the pain you dismiss. She understands the shame you ignore. Her experience is a testament to the urgent need for these laws. Can you look me in the eye and tell me her pain is not reason enough to act? The world stopped. The crystal decanter and 2 fine glasses slipped from Sophia's numb fingers. The sound of them shattering on the cold stone floor was an explosion in the sudden, absolute silence from within the chamber. It was a sound that echoed the shattering of something far more precious, far more fragile, inside her. Every head in the room turned. Dozens of pairs of eyes, curious, shocked, pitying, fixed on her, standing frozen in the doorway. She saw them all. Lord Valerius with his cruel smirk, old Duke Marius, his eyes wide with surprise, young Baron Constantine, his face a mask of discomfort. They were all looking at her, not as their queen, but as a specimen, a talking point, a piece of evidence, a victim. Her gaze found Vlad's. He stood at the head of the great table, his face a storm of conflicting emotions. He saw her. He saw the shattered glass at her feet, and in her eyes he finally saw the devastation. The dawning horror on his face was slow, a creeping tide of realization that came far, far too late. He had been so caught up in the righteousness of his cause, in the power of his argument, that he had never once considered the person at the heart of the story he was telling. He had taken her most sacred secret, the source of her deepest pain and vulnerability, the trust she had placed in him like a jewel, and he had thrown it onto the council table to be used as a political weapon. He had reduced her agony to a rhetorical device. The promise he had made, "This is your story, Sophia, only you decide who knows," mocked her from the ruins of their intimacy. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. The pain was too vast, too deep for such simple expressions. A cold, dead calm settled over her. She felt the eyes of the council on her, stripping her bare, and she felt the weight of Vlad's catastrophic mistake crushing the very air from her lungs. Without a word, without a single glance back at her husband, Sophia turned. She walked away from the shattered glass, from the silent council, from the man who had been her sanctuary and had just become her desecrator. Each step down the long, cold corridor was deliberate, precise. The portraits of his ancestors watched her pass, their painted eyes seeming to judge her, to pity her. The castle that had been her home for 15 years suddenly felt alien, a prison of shared memories that were now all tainted. The safety she had felt just that morning was a phantom, a lie. The trust, so painstakingly built over years, was not just broken, it was obliterated. Gone, as if it had never been. The silence in the council chamber was a living thing, thick and suffocating. Vlad stood frozen, his words still hanging in the air like a foul smoke. He stared at the empty doorway where Sophia had stood, the glittering shards of crystal on the flagstones the only evidence she had been there at all. The image of her face was burned into his mind, the shock, the disbelief, and then the utter, hollow devastation. It was a look he had never seen before, a look he knew would haunt him for the rest of his eternal life. Lord, Valerius cleared his throat, breaking the spell. Your Majesty, he began, his voice laced with a smug sort of concern. Perhaps we should adjourn for the day. Vlad's head snapped toward him, his eyes blazing with a fury so potent the Lord physically flinched. But the anger was a flimsy shield for the chasm of horror opening within him. He had done this. He, who had sworn to protect her, who had been honored by her trust, had inflicted this wound. Get out, he snarled, his voice a low, dangerous command. "All of you. Out." There was no argument. Chairs scraped against the floor as 24 of the most powerful men in the kingdom scrambled to obey, their eyes averted, eager to escape the suffocating tension of their king's catastrophic failure. They filed out silently, leaving Vlad alone in the cavernous room with the echo of his own words and the glittering ruin at the door. He moved toward the doorway, his legs feeling heavy, leaden. He knelt, his fingers hovering over the shards of glass. This was what he had done. He had taken something beautiful and whole, her trust, and smashed it into unrecognizable pieces. "I was trying to help," a weak, defensive voice whispered in his mind. It was for a good cause. They needed to understand. The justifications felt like ashes in his mouth. What good was a law if its foundation was built on the desecration of his wife's soul? He ran, through the corridors, past stunned guards and servants who flattened themselves against the walls at the sight of his face. He burst into their chambers, the room where she had gifted him her trust, and the sight that met him stopped his heart. Sophia was standing by the large wardrobe, her movements calm and methodical. She was folding a cloak, placing it carefully into a traveling trunk that lay open on the bed. Another, larger trunk was already packed and latched beside it. The room, their sanctuary, felt cold, stripped of all its warmth. "Sophia," he breathed, his voice ragged. She didn't look at him. She continued her task, her focus absolute, as if he were nothing more than a piece of furniture. He took a step toward her. "My love, please, let me explain." "Explain what?" she asked, her voice devoid of all emotion. It was a flat, dead thing. "Explain how you decided my pain was a useful tool for your political agenda? Explain the precise moment you concluded my deepest wound was your story to tell?" "No, it wasn't like that," he insisted, desperation clawing at him. "I was trying to make them see, to make them understand the importance of the law. I wanted to give your experience meaning." She finally stopped, the cloak clutched in her hands. She turned her head slowly, and her eyes were the eyes of a stranger. They were cold, empty things, looking right through him. "Meaning?" she repeated, the word a drop of poison on her tongue. "My pain already had meaning, Vlad. It meant that I was hurt. It meant that I was betrayed by my own family. It meant that I carried a fear and a shame for centuries. Its meaning was mine. You did not have the right to assign it a new one. You did not have the right to use it." "I know, I was wrong, terribly wrong," he pleaded, moving closer. He reached for her, his hand outstretched. "Sophia, please. I am so sorry." She recoiled as if his touch would burn her, a sharp, flinching movement that sent a lance of pain through his chest. "Do not touch me," she whispered. He froze, his hand dropping to his side. The space between them crackled with her revulsion. "Your sorrow is for you, Vlad," she said, turning back to her packing. She placed the cloak in the trunk and closed the lid with a soft, final click. "You are sorry because I am leaving. You are sorry because you have been caught. You are not yet sorry for the act itself. You still believe your intentions were noble." "My intentions were noble," he burst out, the defensive words escaping before he could stop them. "I love you. I was fighting for you, for all women." "You were not fighting for me," she corrected, her voice still unnervingly calm. "You were fighting with me, with my trauma. You took the most vulnerable part of me and held it up for public inspection without my consent. That is not love, Vlad. That is betrayal. A different kind, perhaps, than the one in the library, but a betrayal nonetheless. The one person I thought was safe became the one who exposed me to the world." The comparison struck him like a physical blow. He staggered back, the breath knocked from his lungs. betrayal. She had used that word. She was comparing his act, his well-intentioned, loving act, to the brutal crime of a monster. The injustice of it rose in his throat, but one look at her face, her still, pale, shattered face, killed the protest before it could be born. It didn't matter what he intended. It only mattered what he had done. And what he had done had made her feel the same brand of helplessness, of exposure, of being used as an object for someone else's purpose. She picked up her traveling gloves from the bedside table. Her movements were graceful, unhurried, each one a separate, deliberate step away from him, from the life they had built. "Where will you go?" he asked, his voice hollow. "Home," she said simply. "To my family's estate. I need to be somewhere I feel safe." The unspoken words hung between them, "and I am not safe with you." He could not argue. He could not stop her. He had forfeited that right. He could only stand there, a king in his own castle, utterly powerless, and watch as his queen, his love, the center of his universe, walked out of their room, out of his life, without a single backward glance. He was left alone in the ruins, the silence of the chamber a crushing monument to his monumental, unforgivable failure. He had not just broken a promise, he had broken them. The journey to her ancestral home was a blur of gray landscapes and muted colors, a perfect reflection of the desolate state of her soul. The familiar forests and hills of her girlhood, places that had once offered solace, now seemed alien and unwelcoming. Every tree, every stone, felt like a silent witness to her humiliation. She traveled in the royal carriage, the crest on the door a mockery of the protection and status it was supposed to afford. What good was a crown when the king who wore it could not be trusted with her heart? Her brother, Lucian, met her at the gates of the estate. He was older, more stoic, his face a mask of carefully controlled concern. He had received her terse message announcing her arrival and had asked no questions. He simply opened the carriage door, offered her his hand, and led her into the quiet stone halls of their childhood home. The servants were discreet, their gazes averted. The entire household seemed to hold its breath around her, sensing the magnitude of the rift that had sent their queen fleeing back to her family without her king. Lucian showed her to her old rooms, the ones she had occupied as a girl. They were just as she remembered, preserved with loving care, but the sight of them brought no comfort. The library was just down the hall. She closed the door and leaned against it, the solid wood a poor substitute for the sense of security she had lost. She felt exposed, flayed open. The memory of the council chamber was a relentless, repeating horror in her mind. The shocked faces, the pitying stares, Vlad's voice echoing, turning her private agony into public spectacle. He had meant well. A part of her, the logical, rational part that had loved him for 15 years, knew that. He had not acted out of malice. He had acted out of a misguided, arrogant conviction that his noble ends justified his means. He had seen her trauma not as a sacred living part of her, but as an inert tool he had the right to wield. He thought his love gave him ownership of her story. That was the core of the betrayal. It wasn't just that he had told a secret. It was that he had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of that secret. It was not a piece of information. It was a wound, and he had pressed on it, hard, in front of an audience, believing the pain he caused was for a greater good. Days bled into a week. She spoke little, ate nothing. She walked the sprawling gardens where she had once played as a mortal child, the autumn leaves crunching under her feet like brittle, broken promises. She would trace the patterns of the frost on the stone benches, feeling their coldness seep into her. This was what she felt inside, frozen, numb. The vibrant tapestry of her love for Vlad had been bleached of all color, leaving only the stark, gray threads of his betrayal. She relived the moment she had told him, the warmth of the fire, the feeling of absolute safety in his presence. Had it all been an illusion? Had she misread him so completely? For 15 years, she had believed he saw her, truly saw her as his equal. But in that council chamber, He had revealed a deeper, unexamined assumption of his own authority. He was the king. He made decisions for the good of the realm, and he had decided that her story was a resource that belonged, ultimately, to him, to be deployed as he saw fit. The old trauma felt fresh again, not because she was reliving the physical act, but because she was reliving the helplessness, the feeling of her own narrative being stolen from her. The nobleman had taken her body, her father had taken her voice, and Vlad, her beloved Vlad, had taken her story. Each was a theft, a form of betrayal, leaving her feeling powerless and erased. The first of his letters arrived at the end of the week. Lucian brought it to her on a silver tray, his face impassive. She took it, her fingers trembling slightly, and waited until he had gone to break the royal seal. "My dearest Sophia," it began, "the castle is a tomb without you. I cannot eat, I cannot sleep. I was a fool. I know I hurt you, and for that I am more sorry than words can ever express. Please, my love, come home. Let me make it right. I cannot bear this silence between us." She read the words, and a bitter, hollow ache filled her chest. It was just as she had suspected. His letter was all about him, his pain, his emptiness, his need. He was sorry he had hurt her, but only because her hurt was causing him discomfort. He spoke of his love, his remorse, but he demonstrated no understanding of the fundamental principle he had broken. He saw the problem as a broken connection that needed fixing, not a foundational transgression that needed understanding. She did not burn the letter. She simply folded it and placed it in an empty drawer. It required no answer. Her silence, she knew, was the only answer he might, eventually, be able to hear. The castle was a hollow shell. Every room echoed with Sophia's absence. Vlad walked the halls like a ghost, the weight of his guilt a physical shroud. The servants avoided his gaze, the guards seemed to stand straighter, more formally in his presence. He had not only broken his marriage, he had destabilized the emotional core of the court. The king and queen were meant to be the unshakable center, and he had shattered it with a few arrogant, thoughtless sentences. He had sent the first letter in a fever of desperation, driven by the selfish, gnawing ache of her absence. He had poured his own misery onto the page, hoping the sheer force of his regret would move her. When a week passed with no reply, the desperation curdled into a cold dread. He had thought, perhaps, she needed time to calm down, that her anger would cool, and she would remember their 15 years of love. He had underestimated the depth of the wound. He sent a second letter, and a third. They were variations on the same theme. "I love you. I miss you. I am sorry I caused you pain. Please forgive me." He was begging for absolution, for a return to the comfort of their life together. He was focused on the cure without ever diagnosing the disease. The silence from her estate was his only, damning reply. After 2 weeks of this agonizing quiet, he could bear it no longer. He would go to her. He would stand before her, plead his case in person. He would make her see the love that had motivated his terrible mistake. He rode out at dawn, alone, pushing his mount hard, as if his speed could outrun the self-recrimination that pursued him. He arrived at the gates of her family's estate as dusk was settling. The air was cold, the sky bruised with purple and orange. He announced himself to the guards, his voice as king accustomed to immediate obedience. But the gates remained closed. After a long wait, it was not Sophia who emerged, but her brother, Lucian. He approached the gate alone, his expression polite but unyielding. "Your Majesty," Lucian said, his bow correct but lacking its usual warmth. "Lucian, I have come to see my wife," Vlad said, his voice tight. "I am afraid that is not possible," Lucian replied, his tone even. "The Queen is not receiving visitors." Vlad felt a surge of royal impatience. "I am not a visitor. I am her husband. "Open the gate." Lucian's gaze did not waver. "With all due respect, Your Majesty, you forfeited the rights of a husband when you betrayed the trust of your wife. In this house, she is not the queen, and you are not the king. She is my sister, and she is under my protection. She has asked not to be disturbed." The words struck Vlad with the force of a physical blow. Under my protection. The implication was clear. She needed protection from him. He, Vlad, the warrior king who had defended his realm for centuries, was now the threat from which his own wife needed to be shielded. The sheer, damning truth of it stole the breath from his lungs. He was the king, but here, at this gate, his power meant nothing. He had no authority over a broken heart. He stared at Lucian, seeing not the political ally, not the brother of his queen, but the guardian of the sanctuary he had desecrated. He saw the judgment in the man's eyes, and for the first time he felt truly powerless. Defeated, he turned his horse and rode away, the closed gate a symbol of the impenetrable wall he had built between himself and Sophia. The long ride back to his empty castle was a journey into a new kind of despair. It was not the despair of loneliness, but the despair of incomprehension. He had failed. His apologies, his pleas, his very presence, all were rejected. He was trying to repair a breach with tools that were utterly inadequate. It was like trying to mend a delicate tapestry with a blacksmith's hammer. He was only making it worse. Back in his study, surrounded by maps of his kingdom and treaties that had secured peace for generations, he felt like the greatest fool in existence. He could command armies, negotiate with ancient powers, and bend the will of proud lords, but he did not know how to mend the trust he had shattered. He realized with a sickening lurch that he had been approaching this as a king. He had been trying to manage the situation, to restore order, to get back what he had lost. He had not been approaching it as the man who had made a sacred vow and then broken it. He pushed aside the state papers and pulled a heavy volume from the shelves, a book of philosophy, of ethics. He began to read, not for pleasure or for statecraft, but with a desperate, humbling hunger. He needed to understand not just what he had done, but why it was so profoundly wrong. He needed to learn the language of her wound, a language his love and his power had, until now, made him deaf to. He had to stop trying to fix her pain and start the long, arduous work of understanding it. A month passed. The first snows of winter began to dust the castle ramparts. Vlad spent his days in a state of grim discipline. He ran the kingdom, held his councils, and met with his ministers, his face an impassive mask that betrayed none of the turmoil within. But his nights were spent in a self-imposed exile in the royal library, surrounded by books and his own burgeoning shame. He stopped sending his pleading, self-centered letters to Sophia. The silence between them was no longer an agonizing void he had to fill, but a space for reflection, a space he had to respect. He had filled the air with his own voice for too long. It was time to listen to her silence. He replayed the moment she had told him her secret, over and over in his mind. He forced himself to see it not from his perspective, the honored husband, the trusted confidant, but from hers. He saw the courage it had taken, the monumental act of faith. She had handed him the most fragile, wounded part of her soul, a piece of herself she had hidden from the world for centuries. She had trusted him to be its keeper. And what had he done? He had seen it not as a part of her, but as a thing, an object, a powerful, useful story. He had weighed her privacy against the public good, and had found her privacy wanting. In his arrogance, he had believed he had the right to make that calculation on her behalf. He had treated her lived experience as a state resource. He remembered his own words, spoken with such heartfelt sincerity in the firelight of their chamber. "This is your story, Sophia. Only you decide who knows." He had said the words. He had believed them, in a shallow, intellectual way. But he had not understood them. He had not absorbed their fundamental truth. A story of trauma is not an anecdote. It is a piece of a person's being. To tell it without consent is not a breach of etiquette. It is an act of spiritual theft. The realization settled in him, cold and heavy as a block of granite. His crime was not that he had hurt her feelings. His crime was that he had broken her autonomy. He had asserted ownership over a part of her that was not his to claim. His next letter to her was different. He wrote it slowly, carefully, each word weighed and measured. He did not ask for forgiveness. He did not speak of his own loneliness. He did not ask her to come home. "Sophia," he wrote, "I am writing not to ask anything of you, but to offer an acknowledgement of my transgression. I have spent this past month in reflection, and I have begun to understand the true nature of my failure. When you shared your story with me, you gave me a sacred trust. I failed to be worthy of it. I treated your experience as something I could use, even for a cause I believed was noble. I was wrong. It was never mine to use. It was never mine to share. It was, and is, and always will be, yours alone. I broke my promise to you, but my failure was deeper than that. I failed to understand what that promise meant. I failed to see that your autonomy over your own past is absolute. My desire to help was an expression of my own arrogance. I believed I knew best. I did not. Only you know best for you. I understand now that consent is not just for the body. It is for the soul, for the story that makes the soul what it is. I broke that consent. The word is not too strong. It is the only word that fits. I do not expect a reply. I do not expect your forgiveness. You owe me nothing. I am sending this only so that you know I am beginning, finally, to learn the lesson you have been forced to teach me." He signed it simply, Vlad, sealed it, and sent it with a royal messenger. He felt no hope of a positive response. He felt only the grim, quiet satisfaction of having finally articulated the correct nature of his crime. It was not a plea. It was a confession. And with it, he released her. He released her from any obligation to soothe his guilt. Her healing was her own, and he had no right to be a part of it unless, by some miracle, she chose to invite him in. He had to become a man who deserved that invitation, whether it ever came or not. Sophia sat in the winter garden, a heavy fur cloak wrapped around her shoulders. The air was bitingly cold, the sky a sheet of white. A single, perfect snowflake landed on the dark leather of her glove, lingered for a moment, and vanished. The new letters from Vlad had been arriving once a week for the past month. She had left the first few unopened for days, the sight of his seal a fresh pang in the dull ache of her heart. The earlier letters had been so painful to read, so full of his own needs, that she had dreaded more of the same. But when she had finally opened them, the tone was startlingly different. The pleading was gone. The self-pity had vanished. In their place was a quiet, sober accounting of his own failure. He used words she never expected from him, words he had clearly fought to understand. Autonomy, consent, broken trust. He wrote not of how her absence hurt him, but of how his actions had hurt her. He was dissecting the wrongness of his choice, not the unhappiness of its consequences. She read each letter, her wariness slowly giving way to a fragile, tentative curiosity. It was one thing to apologize for causing pain. It was another, far more profound, thing to acknowledge that the act itself was inherently wrong, regardless of the pain it caused. He was beginning to understand that. He was beginning to separate his intention from his impact. She was still wounded. The feeling of safety was a distant memory, a phantom limb that ached with its own absence. The thought of facing the royal court, of seeing those pitying, knowing eyes, still made her feel physically ill. She could not imagine returning to the castle, to their chambers, to the life that had been so thoroughly shattered. But the icy shield around her heart, the one that had frozen her emotions into a solid block of grief and betrayal, was beginning to show the faintest of cracks. He was learning. He was trying. After reading his fourth letter, the one in which he confessed to breaking her consent over her own story, she found herself walking to the estate's library, the room she had avoided for months. She ran her fingers over the spines of the old books, the scent of leather and aging paper a familiar comfort. She pulled out a slim volume of poetry, one she and Vlad had read together years ago during a rare, peaceful winter. She found the passage she was looking for. It was not about love or forgiveness or sorrow. It was about the wisdom of silence, the power of listening, and the way true understanding grows not from speaking, but from attending to what is not said. She did not write a single word in reply. She simply had the book wrapped and sent to him. It was not an invitation to speak further. It was not an offer of forgiveness. It was a test, a curriculum. He said he was learning. This was the next lesson. Stop talking. Stop explaining. Stop centering your own voice. Listen. Watch. Learn from what is done, not from what is said. It was a fragile, dangerous gesture, this small opening. It was a risk. But for the first time in a month, it felt like a risk worth taking. She was not ready to trust him, not by a long measure. But she was, perhaps, ready to see if he could truly become a man worthy of that trust. The book arrived without a note. Vlad unwrapped it, his heart hammering against his ribs. He recognized the worn leather cover instantly. It was a volume of Alaran poetry, a favorite of Sophia's they had discovered together. He opened it and saw a single, delicate marker pointing to a passage. "The wise man does not fill the silence with his own voice," he read. "He sits within it and allows the world to speak its truth. He learns more from the whisper of the wind than the roar of the orator. He understands that presence is a question, not a statement." He read the lines again, and then a third time. The message was unmistakable, clear, devastatingly precise. Stop talking, listen. It was not forgiveness. It was not an invitation. It was an instruction. And it was the first sign of contact she had initiated in over 2 months. It was a sliver of hope so thin and fragile he was almost afraid to breathe on it. He understood. His words, his letters, his apologies. They were all, in their own way, a form of noise. They were his attempts to control the narrative, to explain his remorse, to shape her response. He had to stop. He had to demonstrate his understanding not through words, but through deeds. He had to let his actions speak for him, into the silence she had commanded. He began a new project, one he funded entirely from his personal coffers, keeping it separate from the crown's treasury. He purchased a large, secluded estate on the coast, miles from the capital. He worked with architects and healers, designing a place of refuge, a sanctuary for survivors of hardship. It would be a place for healing, for quiet contemplation, for shared community, run by women who understood the specific needs of its residents. And he instituted one absolute, unbreakable rule, carved into the stone above the entryway. What is shared within these walls remains within these walls. Your story is your own. He oversaw the project himself, traveling to the site, ensuring every detail was perfect. He did not announce it. He did not seek praise for it. He did not even tell Sophia he was doing it. He simply built it. It was his penance. It was his proof. He was creating a physical space dedicated to the principle he had so grievously broken. He was building a place where stories could be safe, because he had failed to be that place for the person who mattered most in the world. He was learning to be a guardian, not a user, of sacred things. And he could only pray that, in the silence, his actions were speaking for him. 4 months to the day after she had left the castle, a royal messenger arrived at Sophia's estate. He did not carry a letter. He carried a single, simple message from the king, dictated to a scribe. He has asked me to tell you that the sanctuary at Silverwood is complete. He will not be there. He says it is not for him. He only wished you to know that it exists. Sophia had, of course, heard the rumors. Whispers of the project on the coast, the sanctuary built with his own fortune, the strange, absolute rule of privacy at its core. She had listened to these reports with a guarded heart. They were actions. They were proof. They were the silent answer she had demanded with her book of poetry. For months, he had respected her silence. He had not written, had not visited. He had simply worked, building a testament to his new understanding. Now, this. A simple message. He only wished you to know that it exists. He wasn't asking her to see it. He wasn't asking for credit. He was simply reporting the fact, like a steward reporting to his lady. She sent a message back, her hand surprisingly steady as she wrote the words. Meet me at the old abbey at sunset tomorrow. It was neutral ground, a place that belonged to neither of them, a ruin that stood halfway between the capital and her family home. It was a place of quiet history, of things that had crumbled but still endured. The next evening, as the sun bled orange and purple across the snow-covered fields, Vlad stood by the crumbling stone wall of the abbey. He was alone, having ridden out without his usual guard. His heart, a thing that had beat steadily through battles and betrayals for centuries, was a frantic drum against his ribs. He had not seen her in 122 days. An eternity. He saw her approaching, a solitary figure against the snow, her dark cloak stark against the white. She moved with her usual grace, but there was a new deliberation in her step, a strength that had been forged in the fire of her grief. The distance between them as she drew near felt like a vast, uncharted ocean. She stopped about 10 feet from him. She said nothing. She simply watched him, her eyes searching his face, looking for the truth of the last 4 months. He saw the caution in her gaze, the lingering shadow of her pain. He remembered her lesson. He did not speak. He did not try to fill the silence with his justifications or apologies. He stood within it, as the poem instructed, and allowed the world, allowed her, to speak its truth. He made his presence a question, not a statement. Have I changed? Can you see it? The silence stretched, thick with the weight of everything broken and everything unsaid. Finally she spoke, her voice clear and calm in the cold air. Why did you build it? The sanctuary. He had rehearsed 100 answers to 100 questions, but he threw them all away. He gave her only the simple, unadorned truth he had discovered in the long, lonely nights of his penance. Because I learned that safety is not a gift a king bestows upon his people, he said, his voice quiet, stripped of all royal authority. It is a fundamental right they deserve. And I learned that the foundation of all safety is privacy, the right to own your own thoughts, your own past, your own story. He met her gaze, holding it steadily. I built a place where stories could be safe, because I had failed to be that place for you. It was an act of repair, not for us. For the principle I broke. She listened, her expression unreadable. She took a small, deliberate step closer, narrowing the chasm between them by a fraction. Her eyes never left his. The final test. If I had never sent the book, she asked, her voice soft but unwavering. If I had remained silent forever, if I had never come back, would you have understood? This was the heart of it all. Was his transformation contingent on her forgiveness? Was it a performance designed to win her back? Or was it a fundamental change in his very soul? He did not have to search for the answer. It was the bedrock of his new existence. Yes, he said, without hesitation. I would have had to. My understanding could not be conditional on your forgiveness. The wrong was absolute, whether you forgave me or not. I had to learn why it was wrong for my own sake. To become a man who could be trusted. To become a man who would never, ever make that mistake again, with you or with anyone. The change had to be for me, for the man I want to be. It could not be for you, or it would not be real. This was the truth she had been waiting to hear. It was the core of everything. He understood that the wrongness was inherent in the act itself, not just in its painful consequences. He understood that his growth could not be a transaction in exchange for her pardon. It had to be a true, deep, and unconditional evolution. A single tear escaped her eye, tracing a glistening path down her cold cheek. It was not a tear of sorrow, but of release. The crushing weight of 4 months of grief, anger, and desolate loneliness finally began to lift. The betrayal was still a part of their history, a deep scar on the landscape of their love. But a scar was something that could be lived with. A scar meant the wound was no longer open and festering. Healing could finally begin. It was not a magical absolution. It was not a return to the perfect, untested trust of before. That was gone forever. What they built now would have to be something different. Something stronger, forged in the fires of betrayal and accountability, tempered by the long, cold work of earned forgiveness. She took another step, closing the remaining distance between them. She did not throw herself into his arms. She did not offer him easy comfort. Instead, she slowly, tentatively, raised her hand, palm up, into the space between their bodies. It was not a gesture of taking, but an offering. An invitation into a new, more conscious, more careful intimacy. His breath caught in his throat. He looked at her outstretched hand, a small, pale thing in the fading light, and understood the immense gift she was offering him. The chance to begin again. Slowly, his own hand rose to meet hers. His fingers, trembling almost imperceptibly, brushed against hers. The touch was feather-light, a question. She did not pull away. Her fingers curled gently, cautiously, around his. It was the first time they had touched in 4 months. The contact was electric, a current of fragile, terrifying, beautiful hope. They stood there as the last light of the sun vanished from the sky, leaving them in the gentle gloom of twilight. The silence between them was no longer a chasm of pain and misunderstanding. It was a quiet space of possibility, a shared breath in the cold winter air. The long road back to each other had just begun, but for the first time, it seemed possible they might walk it together. Forgiveness was not a word spoken in the dusk. It was a hand, finally, safely held.